The first thing Russians do in territories they have conquered is take over the media, television, newspapers, and internet. That's no coincidence. Propaganda is crucial to brainwashing enough of the population to prevent revolts and to terrorize the rest into indifference and silence. Today, I'm looking at the hybrid threats that have been facing Ukraine since at least 2014 and the role of a resilient media in countering Russian disinformation and aggression. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe so more people can discover our excellent speakers. Iryna Subota is Head of Data Analytics at the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security and is a Ph.D. student of Media and Communication Studies program at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and also is a lecturer of educational programs on the development of media literacy and counteracting information threats. She researches the topics of information warfare, propaganda, information, fake news, and media manipulative technologies. Iryna specializes in fact-checking, information verification, and media literacy. Well, I'm really glad to welcome you to the channel, Iryna.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for the invitation to the
I have to
podcast.
ask, the first question, of course, is going to be, what has attracted you to this subject?
I like especially manipulative technologies, and I like to study different methods of especially Russian propaganda, and I try to specialize in information warfare. For me, is very interesting to understand how different countries through the propaganda can manipulate by of the population, and how they can change their vision of the world.
And when did this interest start? Because, of course, many of the Ukrainian speakers I've interviewed say that the revolution of dignity, Maidan, was a trigger for them becoming more active and conscious. But what for you was the sort of trigger in getting interested in this subject?
When it was the revolution of dignity, I studied at 10th forum at the school. Some later at the university, I studied at the program of the journalism, and there I start to study and find interesting materials about fact-checking, about verification information, and one by one I try to understand these manipulative technologies, the psychology side of information warfare, and of course with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of the Russia, I help to Ukraine on the information front against Russia, and so I join some fact-checking project to help to check information, and I had my projects at the work that specialized on the internet freedom, and that specialized on the Russian disinformation narratives. And so in this complex, I try in different ways to help my country to win this war, and to have the security of information space.
And we should say, obviously, to people who are listening as well, you're calling us from Kiev, and I know the electricity has been down for a large part today and through this week. So what you're studying isn't just sort of theoretical or academic. You're actually there at the center of things. Do you feel this information attack in quite a sort of direct way?
Yeah, of course, I feel this informational attack, and but we have different types that can help us in this case, and of course, I think that. Some of these influences we can, of course, to feel from that.
And of course, 2014 is when the first attack really happened. Although, of course, Russia has been meddling in Ukrainian politics and affairs since long before that. But in terms of the real hybrid threats, they really increased then. What is the big differences between the hybrid information threats from 2014 to the start of this year, and now with the full-scale war? How has that threat changed, and the perception of it as well?
Yeah, in fact, Russia use many platforms and methods to create hybrid threats. And what is important is that Russian hybrid threats in the context of the war against Ukraine are aimed both directly at Ukraine and at its partners. And I would divide Russia's hybrid threats against Ukraine into two groups. The first are those that have been going on since 2014 until now. For instance, the first one is information threats, propaganda, disinformation, manipulations, and information psychological operations. Since 2014, Russia discredits Ukraine and all our democratic movements. Next one, this is military threats, occupation and annexation of Ukrainian territories, Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and now all of Ukraine. Ukraine has been under these threats for 8 years. Of course, there is soft power, especially culture. Long before 2014, Russia used culture and, in particular, the mass media to discredit Ukraine. And for example, TV series about Ukrainian heroes showed us as short-sighted heroes. In such way, Russia tried to create the image of Ukrainians for the Russian audience like stupid and short-sighted people. One more, this is cyber attacks, in particular on February 15th, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The largest cyber attack in the history of our country was carried out by Russia. In a couple of hours, banks and governments' websites became unavailable. And one more, this is pseudo-referendums. This is another example of Russian attempts to justify its illegal actions in Ukraine as a part of hybrid warfare. And the second group is those that either appeared after February 24 or maybe played with new strengths or were transformed. For example, food crisis. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been stealing Ukrainian grain, blocking ships in Black Sea region that need to transport grain and other food, also setting fire to fields in Ukraine. And this is the threat not only to Ukraine, but to all world. Another example, this is energy blackmail of Europe and Ukraine. It's a bright example, especially now, how Russian messages work. Since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian propaganda intimidate with energy problems. Now Russia makes her messages true by attacks on the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. And one more, this is nuclear blackmail. In particular, we can see that through Russian messages. According to our monitoring, in the center of the European media landscape, Russia puts itself in the role of a victim who must defend itself from the West. And that's not all the list of the Russian hybrid threats, but all of the mentioned threats were deliberately targeted at Ukraine by the Russian Federation in different stages of the Russian hybrid war against Ukraine. And today, some of them are targeted not only to Ukraine, but at Western countries as well in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine.
And that leads on to an interesting point, because I know you've written a very interesting article about the language that propaganda uses. And one of those techniques, of course, is projection, creating these sort of false flags or false dichotomies, but also projecting what you're going to do or what you've done or the crimes you've committed, and then just accusing your opponent of doing the same. And it's the most simplistic technique, but they use it over and over. But you've also pointed out things like, double speak and double think that, are at the center of something like 1984. So Russian propaganda can be very Orwellian at times, can't it?
Yeah, it's a really very interesting topic how Russia propaganda uses, for example, euphemisms for them, but at the same time, it remains a serious tool for controlling the minds of people in the Russian information field, especially, and masking one's own crimes. For example, any protest in Russia are considered unrest, and anyone disagreeing with the authorities is labeled an extremist. The annexation of Crimea turns into reunification, and the occupation of Ukrainian lands during a full-scale invasion into liberation. But on February 24, new terms were added to the Russian vocabulary, especially, for example, special military operation, denazification, demilitarization. But the last two words turned out to be so difficult for Russian audience, and the authorities tried to abandon them. But after a series of defeats suffered by the Russian military in the south, north, and east of Ukraine, the Kremlin and the Russian ministry restored to constructing a new euphemisms. For example, they said a gesture of goodwill. What does it mean? This means that the withdrawal of the Russian garrisons from Snake Island after Ukrainian artillery established fire control over it. Next one, this is the special operation is going according to the plan. It's again very popular among the Russian propaganda. That means that any military failures of the Russian military can be called part of some global plan, and because no one would explain what is the main purpose of this so-called military operations. One more, this is dramatic reduction of military activity, and this means that the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Kyiv and Chernihiv Oblast due to heavy losses and impossibility of maintaining the support to their army there. Of course, here is one more, like conscious slowing of the pace of the attack, and this means stopping the offensive in the Donbass due to difficulties overcoming Ukrainian defenses. And so on. Especially Russian propaganda has so many euphemisms to make their illegal actions more softy for the population.
And we saw this as well, didn't we, when they withdrew from Kherson? And, there's always this, in the Western media, there's always this kind of, in some sources, perhaps not fear of Ukrainian failure, but fear that Ukraine will be too successful, that somehow that will provoke Russia into some gesture. But when they have these massive, embarrassing defeats, like in Kherson, and they're forced to leave, they just, the propagandists spin it as a victory. They look to some historical example, whether there's any, reality to that or not. They find some way of spinning it to their audience, turning it into a propagandist victory, even the meanest defeats. So do we actually have to worry? If they lose the entire war, they'll just find some way to spin that into another lie.
Yeah, of course, it is another lie, because Russia hasn't their success in Ukraine, but Russian propaganda tries to do this, to construct such picture. And for example, when we research the Kremlin propaganda, we look at how they adjust their workbooks because of its military defeats in war against Ukraine. And we see the following narrative, like that there is no counter-offensive of Ukraine troops, everything goes according to the plan of the special military operation. That was the main message of the Russian propaganda. And of course, Russian propaganda can't have their success because we see how, for example, in the temporarily occupied territories, population distrust Russian propaganda, and for this case, Russia needs to use another ways, not words, not Russian propaganda, but we see different tortures there and so on. So it is a sign that Russia hasn't no victory here, and hasn't influence on our people.
Some of that propaganda is quite reactive. Something happens, like the bombing of the airfields that has happened in the last 2 days, deep inside Russian territory. And they kind of go silent for a bit, then they come up with some ridiculous story. That's the kind of reactive style. Other propaganda, and that used to justify the war, is built on much deeper mythology. And I would almost call it the sort of Russian pathological history. But could you explain a little bit about how Russia weaponizes its history and methodology? Mythology,
Yeah.
sorry, I meant mythology, not methodology.
Mythology. Okay. Yeah, of course. Russia tried to weaponize information and mythology to impact on the population, and of course it use like different channels and different methods and different narratives, because we see that for example, every not when the Russia need to go away from some territories, it changes its narratives, and it's change their messages. So Russian propaganda tries to take the population in the information picture that they constructed. They used, for example, different media channels, and for example, when we talk about Russian audiences, yeah, we can talk about, it is important to admit 3 audiences that Russian propaganda impact on. First of all, this is the Russian audiences. Next one, this is Ukrainian, and the foreign audience. So when we talk about a Russian audience, we see that This is propaganda, use TV shows, use social media, but Russian social media, and the Russian propaganda inside their country use censorship to ban any other alternative information sources and so on, to create only one picture that is according to Kremlin authorities there. So when we talk about Ukrainian audience, we see that now Russia has only one so powerful media or social media like Telegram. This is Russian social media that have no moderation, content moderation, especially when we talk disinformation or fake news. And this is the powerful source to Russian propaganda to impact on Ukraine. When we talk about foreign audience, there Russian propaganda use, of course, their websites like RT. We know that European Union banned, but in the most countries of the world it still works. So in such Russia tries to create their own vision, their own narratives, like using history to rewrite this history and to push different narratives, changed narratives to this audience through different channels and different methods to them.
So Telegram channels are an interesting one because, of course, there is an incredibly diverse range of channels with different voices, different audiences. It will also be used by those who are opponents of the regime, and it will have every shade of opinion from absolute, opposition all the way through to, the extreme nationalism at the other end. But it's unregulated, isn't it? However, do you think propagandists in Russia are manipulating certain Telegram channels that have certain, audience profiles? Are they injecting their messages consciously into that? Or are they influencing people who then create these channels and repeat the messages? What's the sort of machinery behind influencing Telegram?
Of course, we think that one of the important and dangerous characteristic of Telegram that it can we can create a channel there anonymously. So some of them we can't find the author of this channel, but of course we find the information where we understand that some of these channels in the Telegram is used and created by Russian authors, and especially by Russian authorities that try to manipulate by these authors to make these messages, to push these messages. And their main characteristic of channels, pro-Russian channels that we find in Ukraine for Ukrainian audience is that these channels try to mimic for Ukrainian, just have the same names or have some Ukrainian symbols there, and then to push different propagandistic messages there, but at the same time, in such the way, like with names, with pictures, they try to be like reliable for Ukrainian audience. But of course, with this understand, and we make different list of these Telegram channels and we explain why it is bad for consumption the information from that channels using and showing different cases from these Telegram channels. But of course, on the Russian audience, the more powerful and there. And we have one research that Telegram is very popular among the different social media in the East, in the Ukraine and in the East Europe. So like this.
And of course, it's utilized by the so-called Z propagandists. So there are a bunch of extreme sort of nationalists on there, and of course, a lot of information from the front line. Propagandistic information, but a lot of information about Russian troops are sent back via those channels. So it's a fairly direct, albeit it can be quite toxic media. Another aspect, turning back to the mythology, Russia has used a lot of the, I would call it sort of, Soviet prejudices as well. And one of the most powerful ones, of course, is this idea that despite all of these troubles, despite the war and the aggression, underneath it all, Ukraine and Russia are brotherly nations, and somehow the West has turned Ukraine against its natural ally. And that's the basic of the myth, but it goes beyond that, doesn't it? Into, well, if you take that as true, then Ukraine doesn't really exist. And Ukrainian language doesn't really exist, and culture isn't really that distinct from Russian. And it's like it could all come together. And why do you struggle against this? These messages, of course, are much more prevalent in the east of the country, and perhaps worked much better prior to 2014, and of course this year in 2022. Do you think this narrative is not effective anymore, or less effective than it was?
I think that the most of these narratives and phrases are left in the past. For example, Russian propaganda is less and less justifying its invasion of Ukraine by brotherly nation. Instead, it began to openly conduct an information war and a military war against Ukraine. And now, instead of messages about this is brotherly nation, more and more talk is about war against Ukraine and even against the West and NATO. As for the Ruski Mir or Russian values, the whole world has already understood what the Ruski Mir really is and what are the real values of Russia. So it is also not popular message in the world. Now another trend in Russian propaganda, and it is to accuse everyone of Russophobia, and Russophobia for Russian propaganda, including any things. It can be military aid for Ukraine, it's sanctions, it's difference. It's different support of Ukraine and so on. As I can see that these narratives that were popular at the beginning, for example, in 2014, now didn't now don't work in the information space.
I can absolutely see that. And of course, until your city is attacked, you could be receptive to those messages. Once your city has been attacked and sometimes destroyed, that becomes less believable. And taking that example, Mariupol, I mean, I now know quite a few families from there who are in the UK, and it's very disturbing hearing the stories of how they got out of there, and understanding what has happened to that city in particular. But one of the articles you shared on LinkedIn, which really caught my attention, is that civil society in Ukraine has been sort of growing and evolving over the last few years and really driven much faster and deeper by Maidan and those events. What Russia seems to be doing in the territories it's occupied is creating a fake civil society, fake institutions, public events, and so on, and very much involving children in these exercises. Could you tell me a little bit about this fake civil society initiative?
Yeah, of course. Different fake civic society institutions and cultural events are the methods used by Russia, especially in the temporarily occupied territories, and the main purpose of these actions is to instill the so-called Ruski Mir in the minds of the temporarily occupied populations. For instance, young people in the temporarily occupied territories, they are tried to be included into different all Russian activities. For example, trips to Russia that they organized for them. Or or Russia can create different culture activities as well, like in these temporarily occupied territories, and of course they can to so-called to make unit like Russian and try to mix with Ukrainian to make different cultural events. And for example, one more that for integration, this is regional cooperation with neighboring regions of Russia. They try to implement it with engagement of Russian civic organizations, fake organizations, but we understand that these methods is used to support their messages, their narratives, like that Russian propaganda push the message after these fake pseudo-referendums that territories return to their home, like this said Russian propaganda, but and through these actions, Russia try to show in the action why to support the narrative about this Russian home. But of course, all these methods we see that not working, because the Ukrainian military return our territories, and our people are waiting for Ukraine and for Ukrainian military. So we can say only like fake and pseudo events by Russia in these territories.
So it's really not getting through to people, which of course is good. And obviously there's been this period of 8 years of attack. And in 2014, the Ukrainian army was relatively disorganized, not that well equipped. And they managed to sort of hold the line, and but they weren't able to retake Donbass. But there's been 8 years to prepare militarily, and we see a lot of evidence of, a lot of investment in uniforms, training, techniques, and equipment, which is paying off. Has there been a similar sort of focus on, the ways to counteract disinformation? So has there also been an investment in counter propaganda, in media literacy and education?
Yeah, of course, there we can say that this different threats that Russia make for Ukraine in information sphere, in education sphere, and when we see the cases in the temporarily occupied territories, like to change the educational programs to start teaching Russian, to start teaching. So we see that we can use different methods to counteract these threats. And of course, one of them, we need to understand that Russia tried to block all ways to connect between Ukraine and temporarily occupied territories. In communication, for example, channels like when Russia tried to block the internet connection with Ukraine and to return and to give to give our people the right vision of the situation, we need to find a new communication. How can we to talk with them? How can we spread our true information for them? And in these different spheres, we can, of course, have impact and counteract them on different levels like that.
And of course, there's a big debate in the disinformation sort of research area on what is the most effective thing to counter, or whether you need a collection of different strategies. So fact checking is of course one, very early one that was tried, and it's relatively successful. Then you've got counter propaganda, that's fighting propaganda with more propaganda. That, I think, has been shown to be far less successful. And then media literacy, which has really developed a lot in the last year or so, and very effective campaigns such as Filter, which have been developed. What's your view on, on the effectiveness of these different methodologies, and how do you think they're going to evolve more in the future?
Yeah, in my opinion, there are no one or two effective methods in counteracting hybrid or information threats. The counteracting and preventive measures should take place comprehensively. For example, in Ukraine, we have a great number of information security organizations that focus on a specific method or maybe use some of them together. And for instance, among these methods, like you mentioned, fact-checking, positive narrativization, monitoring and use of big data, in the identification information threats, but the power of these institutions and organizations in their interaction and cooperation among themselves for more effective results. So when you talk about media literacy, this is of course the powerful method to counteract hybrid and information threats, because in particular, the threat of obvious fakes will be eliminated in this way. A person who knows basic knowledge from the beginning will not believe in a simple fake or absurd statement, and manipulation for the enemy become more difficult. And why it is important media literacy in our time, that of course that We use a new communication technology every day, and so we need to know how to use them correctly, how to to consume the information from that, how to choose the correct information, how we can verify this information, and so on. It is a very important skill for 21st century media literacy. Uh, uh,
Of course, Ukraine has much more experience of defending itself. What do you think the West can learn from Ukraine's experience and the developments and advances you've made in countering propaganda?
For example, based on our experience, we can say about some elements how to build resilience to these hybrid threats and information threats to each country. For example, it can be the first of all to develop and maintain original culture. We understand that culture is a powerful weapon for the enemy, and if we don't have our own culture, we can borrow from the enemy and have its direct influence on our population. So to develop and maintain original culture is very important. Of course, um, uh, can be to develop the brand of the country and to spread it in the international area as a preventive measure, because the image of the country shouldn't be built by enemies, but first by this country itself. Ukraine has also great examples of different media projects like civil or state media projects that tell about Ukraine to the world. And they are currently focused on covering the war, Russia against Ukraine. But however, earlier, their prior aim was to show the beauty of Ukraine, to show the advantage of Ukraine. Next one, we know about one method of Russian propaganda that they try to push when something happens, they try to push different versions of this situation. In such a case, they try to make somebody doubt in these versions, and we understand that we need to inform and communicate to the international audience about what is happening in the country, and in particular in case of emergencies, because the problem with most of the Western media is not that they play along with the Russian Federation, but the problem that they don't know what is really happening and how to communicate it properly. So we need to explain this and use like preventive measures. And of course, this is maybe the last one. This is to develop a system of information protections against hybrid and informational threats. It is worth understanding that the information space must have the same defense system as the military sphere, which protect territorially. So today we have a huge number of such institutions that, as I said, that they work harmoniously and comprehensively together to one result, to win the war.
That's absolutely fascinating. And it's so important at this time. And I don't know what your feeling is. I mean, the war will come to an end, but Russia will probably not stop being a threat. I mean, it seems unlikely that a liberal regime will spring into place, remove the massive lies factory, the machine, the troll factories, the diplomatic network, all the tools of the Russian state that amplify and project these lies. That probably won't go away, will it? So all the techniques you're developing will continue to be important even after the war?
I think that methods that I mentioned will be important and after the war. But of course, I can say that it can be that preventive measures. We need to understand that the information space needs to be secure every time. And so we need to have like pre-banking methods to, of course, we can have the methods of saying what can happen, what information threats can be in the information space for our nation, and um, also it need to be fact checking because it is the main part of all information that spread in the environment. And so when we talk about social media, this is the space for much disinformation, not only about Ukraine and about war in Ukraine, but of course about different, like we saw with coronavirus and so on. But after all, we need to use fact checking because we can have another problem, we can have another topics that can be used by propagandists, by disinformators, and so on. And of course, it can be a positive narrativization that need to show our countries in the international area, to show our advantages and our differences that is very great for our world.
Well, Iryna, that's been absolutely fascinating. I love the level of detail that you bring to all these issues. And I really hope the work you're doing, because I know you're very active in events and conferences and seminars. I hope that activity has, a real impact. It's amazing what you and your team and colleagues are doing. And yeah, I wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your insights with our audience.
Thank you for the invitation again, and it was very great to share our experience with the audience and with you, of course. So it's very great.
And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!